He'd buried the dream of fatherhood beneath snow and silence, but they came with nothing but names and hunger. $3 changed their fate. One whisper changed his. The mountain didn't give second chances easily. Snowpack lingered even into the spring, reluctant to let go of what the cold had taken. Bears were hungry, creeks were swollen, and the wind still had a bite to it, even as April stretched long across the valley. But the man who stepped down from the freight wagon at the edge of Grafton was used to cold. For years, it had been the only thing that touched him. He stood tall and broad, wearing a coat older than most buildings in town, fur-lined and patched in places where claw or fire had once tested its strength. His boots bore the scars of countless winters, and the wide-brimmed hat sat low on his brow, shadowing the sharp, weathered lines of a face that hadn't known softness in a long while. His name was Heath Camden, and no one in town knew much more than that. Just that he came down once every season to trade furs, salt, and roots, and then vanished back into the mountains before the sunrise had warmed the ground. So when he lingered that morning, standing still while the wagon pulled off, heads turned. They didn't know his reason, didn't know about the letter tucked into his coat pocket, creased from being unfolded too many times. They didn't know that 6 months earlier, a doctor in Fort Cannon had given him a long stare and a solemn nod, after a quiet conversation filled with enough words like scar tissue and won't ever take, that it felt like someone had cut something from inside him. Not just hope, but identity. A man who'd once built a cabin by hand for a family that never came now found himself alone in a home with 3 chairs too many. So he came down from the mountain, not knowing what he was looking for, only that he couldn't keep doing nothing. The town's bustle grew louder near the churchyard, where someone had tacked up a poster that made his stomach turn. Auction today, not livestock, not tools, children. The church bell rang twice. On the steps, a woman in a gray dress and a too-tight bonnet shouted over the murmurs of the crowd. 3 mouths, all siblings, ages 6, 4, and just barely 2, no known ailments, no surviving kin, no charity placements left. Behind her, huddled together like stray animals, were 3 children with coats too thin for spring and eyes too wide for their age. The eldest, a boy, stood in front of the others like a sentry, jaw clenched. The girl beside him gripped the baby's hand so tightly their knuckles were white. No one in the crowd moved. No one offered a bid. $2 for the set, the woman barked. Anyone. Heath didn't think. He stepped forward and reached into his coat. 3. The crowd gasped, not because of the amount but because of who'd said it. The woman blinked. Sir, do you understand? Heath didn't answer. He just walked up the steps, dropped 3 silver coins into her gloved hand, and knelt before the children. The boy squared his shoulders like a soldier. We don't bite. Heath almost smiled. Didn't figure you did. The girl whispered, you live in a house. He nodded. Got food. He nodded again, slower this time. Then he looked at the littlest one. She hadn't said a word, just stared up at him, blinking once, then twice. And then she whispered a name so soft he nearly missed it. Pa. The sound hit him like thunder. He hadn't heard that word in years, not aimed at him, not even in dreams. He looked up at the woman in charge, whose face had paled, and who now wrung her hands nervously. She's barely spoken in a week, she murmured. No one told her to say that. Heath didn't speak. He simply reached for the smallest child and picked her up. She didn't resist, just nestled her head into the crook of his neck and sighed. The crowd began to whisper. Crazy old man. Reckless. He's got no wife. No future. But Heath didn't hear them. He only heard the faint breath of a little girl against his collarbone and the rustling of 2 older siblings as they stepped closer, unsure but willing. He'd gone to town to forget what he couldn't be. Instead, he walked back toward the mountain with 3 reasons to try again. The trail was steep, and the wagon he'd borrowed groaned under their weight, not because of supplies but because of the questions now sitting in silence behind him. The boy's name was Isaac. He spoke little, but when he did, it came out in crisp, careful sentences, like someone used to keeping everything inside. The girl was Nora, 4 years old and already showing signs of stubbornness that rivaled any mule Heath had ever known. She sat with her arms crossed, only uncrossing them when it came time to feed the baby. And the baby, she never said the word again. Not yet, but she kept looking at him like she might. They reached the cabin by dusk, shadows long and purple across the clearing. He'd left it as he always did, wood stacked, fire laid, blankets clean. But now it felt foreign, too small, too sharp, like it had never been built to hold laughter or lullabies or the thud of tiny boots on pinewood floors. Still they went in. Heath cooked, porridge with dried berries. None of them said much while eating. Isaac stared at the flame, Nora poked at her bowl like it owed her answers, and the baby, she leaned against Heath's side, sticky hands in his sleeve, and eventually drifted off to sleep again with a sigh that sounded far too trusting. That night Heath didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, every log that cracked feeling like a question he couldn't answer. He had no wife. No idea how to raise one child, let alone 3. No plan. But he had 3 silver coins fewer, 3 small hearts under his roof, and the sound of a name he hadn't earned, but wasn't about to walk away from. The next morning arrived without warning, sunlight creeping across the cabin like it was afraid to wake what it didn't understand. Heath stirred from his chair, his neck stiff, boots still on, a blanket he didn't remember pulling over himself. He blinked slowly, eyes drawn to the small figures curled together near the hearth, where the fire had long since turned to ash. They were still here. It wasn't a fever dream. 3 children, his now or something like it. They hadn't run, hadn't cried through the night. They'd simply folded into the cabin like they'd been part of it all along, like they belonged more than he did. Heath stood, his knees protesting, and made his way outside. The air was crisp, birdsong threading through the pine branches. He'd built this place with his own hands, years ago when he still thought it would echo with something other than silence. Now it sat under the weight of unfamiliar hope. By the time he came back inside, Isaac was awake, standing stiff and alert like he'd been waiting for trouble. "You're not taking us back?" the boy asked, not with fear but with quiet defiance, like he already knew what people did when they changed their minds. "No," Heath said simply and started ladling oats into bowls. "You eat." Isaac nodded once. "Good, then you help after." Nora sat up, hair tangled like a squirrel's nest, eyes squinting in suspicion. She muttered something about porridge again, how everything tasted like old socks, and Heath almost laughed. Almost. But instead he slid a bowl her way and said nothing. The baby, Lottie, that's what Nora called her, though no one had confirmed it, crawled into his lap again like she'd always been there. She'd barely spoken, just clung to him whenever she could, like something in her recognized something in him. He didn't know what that meant yet, only that her little arms felt like an anchor, and for a man who drifted for too long, he didn't mind being held down. After breakfast, he put them to work. Isaac followed him outside where the goat pen needed mending. Heath handed him a mallet, watched how the boy studied the broken plank, and nodded when Isaac set to work without being told what to do. The kid wasn't soft. He wasn't lazy either. He'd been taught something by someone once, probably their father, Heath guessed. And that meant there was a memory still tender beneath the surface. One misstep and Heath could crush it. He stayed quiet, letting the rhythm of the hammer speak instead. Nora wandered outside next, dragging a broom twice her size. She swept the porch with the fury of a judge, muttering about dust everywhere and boys being no help. He let her mutter, let her stomp, but when she tripped over a loose board and scraped her elbow, he was there before she could bite back the tears. She winced, but when Heath knelt and gently checked the scrape, she didn't flinch, just stared at him. "My papa used to carry peppermints in his pocket," she said abruptly. Heath blinked. I don't have those. She shrugged. You got oatmeal. It's not the same, but it counts. That night after chores and supper, Isaac helped stack more firewood. Heath passed him a cup of water and gestured toward the stump near the edge of the clearing. The boy sat, slow and stiff. You got questions, Heath said. Not a guess, just a fact. Isaac kept his eyes on the cup. Where's your wife? Heath didn't answer at first. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something old. She's gone, he said at last. Years now. Isaac nodded like he understood, though he couldn't possibly. Not fully. You don't got any other kids? No. Silence stretched. Then why'd you buy us? Heath didn't bristle, just let the question hang like smoke in cold air. Felt like I had more room than most, figured that was enough. Isaac stared at him a long moment, then gave a single nod, slow and solemn, before standing and heading back to the cabin. That night as the fire crackled and the children drifted to sleep, Heath pulled out the letter again. The one from the doctor, the one that told him he'd never be a father, not by blood, not by birth. He'd read it so many times the ink was starting to blur, but tonight he didn't feel like it defined him. Not anymore. He folded it once more, tucked it into the fire and watched it turn to ash. By the end of the first week, the cabin had changed. It wasn't louder, Heath wouldn't allow chaos, but it was warmer. Nora had claimed a corner of the room for her dolls, which she'd made from leftover kindling and scraps of cloth. Isaac took to carving, his first attempt being a crooked-looking rabbit that Nora pretended was real just to annoy him. Lottie, meanwhile, followed Heath everywhere. From the chicken coop to the woodshed, she was a shadow with sticky hands and the occasional hiccuping giggle. They were adjusting. But then came the storm. It hit without warning, wind and sleet hammering the mountain before Heath had time to shutter every window. The fire struggled. The roof groaned. And somewhere in the middle of the night, Lottie woke up screaming. Heath stumbled from bed, heart racing. The girl was standing by the fire, eyes wide, pointing at the door. Someone outside, she whispered. Heath froze. He hadn't heard a thing, but she was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Nora sat up next, clutching her doll, and Isaac was already at the window, peering through the foggy pane. I don't see anything, the boy said. But Heath wasn't taking chances. He grabbed the rifle from above the door and cracked it open. Wind slammed into him like a fist, but he stepped outside anyway, eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no tracks, no sound. But something wasn't right. He turned back toward the door and found a piece of paper nailed to it. The handwriting was jagged, scrawled in haste, but the message was clear. They ain't yours, don't forget it. Heath ripped it down, heart thundering. Inside, the children waited, watching him with wide eyes. What is it? Isaac asked. Heath looked at them, all three. Just wind, he said. But he didn't sleep that night. Nor the one after. He kept the fire lit, kept the rifle close, and made sure the children never left the clearing alone. He thought the mountain had left him in peace, that maybe he'd carved out a quiet corner for them to grow. But someone out there hadn't let go of the past. And they were coming to reclaim what Heath had just begun to believe might finally be his. The snow didn't let up for 3 more days. It came in thick, wind-driven waves that buried the trails, swallowed the fence posts, and turned the world outside Heath's cabin into a quiet white tomb. The fire had to be fed near constantly, and even Nora stopped complaining about the smell of wood smoke on her clothes. Lottie barely left his side, and Isaac took to sleeping with a hatchet by his cot. There was no use pretending they hadn't all read the note. The fear was there in every cautious glance out the window, in every flinch when a branch tapped the wall. Heath said nothing more about it. He kept his jaw tight and his rifle cleaned. But he started keeping watch by the window at night, sitting in the old chair with the worn leather arms, eyes trained on the tree line until the sun bled through the frost. On the fourth morning, the storm broke. Clear skies brought silence so heavy it pressed against the ears. No birds, no breeze, just the creak of trees thawing in the slow return of sunlight. Heath took it as a warning. Nature never quieted that much unless something unnatural had stirred it. He saddled his mare and left Isaac with a warning to keep the girls inside. Then he rode down the mountain trail, retracing the path he'd come up not long ago with 3 little strangers in tow. But where there should have been nothing but snow and scrub, he found fresh tracks. Wagon wheels, hoof prints, boot marks. Someone had come up the ridge during the storm. And someone had left in a hurry. He followed them halfway to town before they veered west, deeper into the forested stretch that the locals called Dead Man's Hollow. A place no one went willingly, not even him. Too many stories of old miners gone missing, too many caves that breathed strange winds and never let sound echo. He turned back. That night Isaac asked, "You think it's their kin?" Heath didn't need to ask who he meant. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe kin ought to stay buried if they left you like that in the first place." Isaac said nothing, but he didn't argue, and that silence told Heath plenty. The days settled again. Routine found its shape. Heath taught Isaac how to trap rabbits, how to clean them without waste. Nora was a natural in the garden, fussing over the cabbage shoots like they were pets. Lottie still followed Heath everywhere, her small hand constantly seeking his. One morning she reached for it even before her eyes were open. And that's when it happened. She mumbled something, half asleep. "Papa, wait." Heath froze. The word had struck him like a rifle's report. "Papa." Not Mr., not Heath. "Papa." He didn't correct her, didn't breathe even. Lottie, oblivious, leaned her cheek against his arm and went back to sleep. Heath couldn't move for a long while. That evening he stood out back, splitting wood, arms burning from the weight of something more than labor. His mind spun. That word, it shouldn't have meant so much. But it did. He'd buried that part of himself years ago, buried it with the doctor's letter, with the empty cradle his wife had kept by the hearth until the day she died. And now here it was, unearthed by a child who didn't even know what she'd said. He didn't notice the stranger until the second shadow fell across the snow. Heath turned sharply, axe in hand. A man stood by the edge of the trees, broad, wrapped in a thick coat, wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes. He didn't look armed, but Heath knew enough not to believe what you could see. "You're the one bought him," the man said, voice rough as gravel. Heath didn't answer, just tightened his grip on the axe. "I ask 'cause there's talk," the man went on. "Talk that a mountain hermit went and took 3 kids for himself. That true?" Heath stepped closer, eyes narrow. "Why you care?" The man shrugged. "Because one of 'em's mine." "A lie." "It had to be." "They were sold fair," Heath said. "You come to undo it." "No," the man said, and that chilled Heath more than a threat. "I come to warn you. You think buying 3 throwaways for a few dollars means you own peace. Think again. They weren't left. They were hidden. And now the man that was looking for 'em knows where they went." He turned and walked off without another word, vanishing into the trees like fog. Heath didn't sleep that night either. The next morning he told the children they'd be moving. Not far, just to the old trapping cabin 2 ridges over, one he hadn't used in years. But it was smaller, easier to defend. They didn't question him, not even Nora. Lottie held his hand the whole way, and Isaac took the rear, head swiveling every few steps like he expected someone behind every pine. The cabin was little more than logs and nails. 1 room, a loft above, a stove that groaned when it worked, but it would do. Heath sealed the windows, rigged the door with wire and a bell. He set traps on the path and started keeping watch at both ends of the day. Isaac learned how to reset the snares. Nora patched holes in the walls with old quilts. Lottie made a nest under the stairs and called it her secret castle. They built a life there. It was quieter but not peaceful. Not yet. Then one night Nora came running from the outhouse, pale and shaking. "There's a man in the woods," she gasped, "watching." Heath grabbed the rifle and storm lantern and plunged into the trees. The snow had mostly melted, but the earth was soft enough to leave prints. He found them, heavy, deep, pacing in a tight line behind the cabin. No attempt to break in, just watching. That night he sat awake, rifle across his lap, the children curled together in the loft above. And in the flickering firelight, a thought he didn't want took root. What if this wasn't about the children? What if it was about him? He'd lived in peace for too long. A man like him, broken, barren, tucked away in the woods, wasn't supposed to find something like this. 3 hearts beating near his. 3 voices calling him something like father. Maybe the world didn't like when men like him tried to be whole again. But he wasn't giving them up. Not now, not ever. He tucked the fire lower and stared at the window until dawn. When the first crow cawed, he made a decision. They'd go to town, not to live, just to learn, to find out who this watcher was, to root out the truth behind the warning and the shadows. He packed up supplies, told the children to stay close, and led them down the trail. The town of Fern Hollow wasn't much. A few shops, a schoolhouse, a church that hadn't seen a preacher in 6 months. But gossip ran stronger than the river, and Heath knew how to listen without being noticed. At the feed store, he learned a man had come through asking questions. A stranger with a scar on his cheek and a limp, said he was kin to some lost kids. No one had challenged him. Why would they? Orphans didn't matter much to men with nothing to lose. At the saloon, he learned more. The man's name was Barlow, used to run caravans between Fern Hollow and Dawson Ridge, had a reputation for drinking too much and caring too little. But once, years ago, he'd had a woman. She died in childbirth. He'd left the baby with her cousin. 2 years later, the cousin and her children disappeared. Heath's blood went cold. 3 children, a cousin, vanished. It wasn't coincidence. It was them. He left town in a hurry. When he reached the cabin, he knew before he opened the door. The children were gone. And the traps hadn't been triggered. Which meant whoever took them had known the way. The cabin was too quiet. The fire had long gone out, cold ashes scattered across the hearthstone. Lottie's doll lay on the floor near the stairs, her little bonnet torn. Nora's coat still hung from the nail by the door. But the room was empty. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, just silence. Heath moved like a man possessed, checking the traps first, then the surrounding brush. He found the back trail disturbed, boot tracks leading west toward the ridge. The same pattern as before, wide-set, heavy, deliberate, but no small prints beside them, which meant the children were either carried or led. He knelt, fingers brushing over the edge of a deep indent where someone had slipped. Small foot. Not carried. They'd gone on their own, which meant they weren't screaming, not yet. That gave him time, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but not days. He packed lightly, only a rifle, spare bullets, his knife, a roll of jerky, and Lottie's scarf tucked into his coat pocket. It still smelled faintly of the pine soap Nora liked to boil on wash days. He took off running. The trail led him farther west than he'd ever gone on foot, down into a gully thick with brush and wild thorn. The mountain sloped hard here, and old rock slides left the paths uneven, dangerous. More than once he stumbled, but the prints remained clear. Barlow wasn't hiding his path. That told Heath something dangerous. The man didn't think he had to. At dusk, he reached the mouth of a cave. The entrance was narrow, barely 3 feet across, but deep enough that darkness swallowed everything beyond the first few feet. The air that came out was cold, wet, sour. A lantern flickered inside. And something else, a voice. faint, crying. Heath moved without thought. Rifle in hand, he slipped inside, boots careful not to echo on the damp stone. The cave snaked downward, twisting until the light of the outside world disappeared completely. Every few steps he saw signs: a torn scrap of fabric, a scuff on the wall, Lottie's ribbon caught on a jagged rock. Then the tunnel opened into a cavern. Small fire at the center. 3 children huddled against the far wall, bound at the wrists but otherwise unhurt. And Barlow. Heath's first instinct was to raise the rifle and end it, but the man turned before he could fire, revealing he held Lottie against his chest, knife pressed to her small neck. Her face was red from crying, cheeks streaked with grime. "You don't want to do that," Barlow said, voice eerily calm. "I'm not here to talk," Heath growled. Barlow's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Then maybe you came to trade." Heath's finger twitched on the trigger. "Put her down," he said. "Not until you listen. I don't bargain with men who steal children." Barlow laughed. "You think I stole 'em? You think you did? They're mine, blood don't lie. That boy, he's got my brother's chin. The girl, Nora, spits just like my cousin did when she's mad. And this one," he held Lottie tighter, "she's got my sister's eyes." "You left them," Heath said. "Doesn't matter who you are, you left." Barlow's jaw clenched. "I was young, didn't know how to raise no kids." "And now?" Barlow's expression twisted. "Now I ain't got nothing, and they're all I got left." Heath took one step forward. "Then let them go." "Why? So you can play house on that mountain like you earned it. I bet they call you Pa, don't they? That sting a little knowing they ain't yours." Heath didn't answer. Because yes, it had stung, at first, but not anymore. Not after nights of Nora pressing her forehead to his shoulder when the wind howled. Not after Isaac asking how to trap squirrels so he could help with dinner. Not after Lottie, barely awake, whispering "Papa" like it was the only word she trusted. He stepped forward again. Barlow flinched. "You fire that thing, she dies," he said, voice shaking now. Heath lowered the rifle, just enough for the barrel to tilt toward the dirt. "Then don't give me a reason to." Barlow looked at the kids, then at the fire, then at his hand still holding the blade. And something cracked in his expression. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, "to want something so bad and never have it." Heath did not blink. "Yes, I do." That made Barlow hesitate. "Then you know how it feels to look at a child and see everything you lost, everything you can't be." Heath nodded slow. "But I also know it ain't the child's fault." Barlow blinked, his hand trembled, and for a second the knife lowered just an inch. Lottie screamed. She twisted in his arms, small fists flailing, and that was all Heath needed. He moved in a blur, the rifle dropped, his knife was out. He tackled Barlow and the 2 men hit the cavern floor hard. They grappled in the dirt, fists and elbows and rage. The knife clattered away. Heath took a hit to the ribs. Barlow got him in the chin, but then Heath was on top, knee in the man's chest, knuckles raining down until Barlow stopped moving. He stood, chest heaving. Lottie ran into his arms. Nora and Isaac followed, their bindings loose now, faces pale but unbroken. Heath pulled them all close, one arm around each. "We're going home," he said. Back at the cabin, the fire crackled warm. The storm had passed, the traps were reset, and the children, his children, slept soundly, bundled close under the thick old quilt. Heath sat by the fire, Lottie's ribbon wound around his hand. There was more to come. Barlow wouldn't be the last ghost from the past. The world didn't let men like Heath keep joy without a fight. But tonight he didn't feel barren, he didn't feel broken. He felt full. Not because he'd bought them. Because he'd fought for them. Because somehow, in a world that had told him he'd never be a father, 3 children had chosen to call him one anyway. And nothing, not fear, not blood, not the past, could take that from him. Snow began to melt from the ridges come mid-March. Little by little, the gray crust of winter cracked and gave way to muddy roads and patches of stubborn green. The cabin roof still bore weight in the early mornings, and frost clung to the windows like lace, but there were birds again, and for the first time in months, Heath didn't have to split wood with urgency in his chest. The storm had passed, not just the one in the sky, but the one inside him too. Heath never thought peace could sit so quietly. Nora had taken to humming again, usually when she swept or fetched eggs from the henhouse. Isaac spent hours carving wood, bent over the stump with a dull blade and more patience than any child ought to possess. And Lottie, she had started to laugh in her sleep. He'd sit beside the stove late at night, listening to those tiny chuckles from the loft, marveling at how a child who had seen too much still found space in her dreams to be happy. But peace was a thing that trembled when stared at too long. Heath had learned that. So when the rider came, he wasn't surprised. He heard it first, the beat of hooves, uneven and hard against thawing dirt. Not a neighbor, not a friend. The kind of rhythm a man rides when he doesn't plan to stay long. Heath stood up from where he'd been oiling the hinges on the barn doors and stepped outside, wiping his hands on his coat. The children were inside, Nora watching over a pot of beans, Isaac and Lottie painting the porch steps with leftover milkwash. The rider dismounted slowly. Dusty brown coat, trimmed beard, badge on his chest so polished it looked out of place in the frontier grit. "Marshal?" Heath asked, stepping forward. The man nodded once. "Heath McAllister." Heath's shoulders tensed. "That's right. I need a word." They walked a few yards from the cabin. The marshal glanced once toward the window where Nora's face peeked through the curtain, and then turned fully to Heath. "You aware there's a price on a man named Boone Barlow?" Heath's jaw clenched. "I am. Wanted in 3 territories. Assault, child abandonment, extortion, attempted murder. Pretty list. He won't bother anyone anymore." "That's so?" Heath didn't answer. The marshal read it in his eyes. "Well," the man muttered, pulling a slip of paper from his coat, "you're lucky someone turned him in before you went vigilante. Wanted posters ain't law anymore, but the bounty system's still intact in this part of Montana. We caught him 3 weeks ago trying to jump a freight out of Butte. He was talkative." Heath raised a brow. The marshal tucked the paper back in. "Said you bought 3 kids for $1 each. Told us you had no right." Heath folded his arms. The marshal looked back at the cabin. "Problem is, he's not entirely wrong. Kids need papers, guardianship, signatures. You can't just trade $1 and call it legal. They were being sold like livestock. I didn't have time for paperwork." "I'm not arguing your heart, McAllister, but the law is slower than the heart. Always has been." The 2 men stood in silence, cold wind brushing their coats, stirring the trees. Then the marshal cleared his throat and pulled out another envelope. Spring deepened across the valley, and with each passing day, the world around Heath McAllister began to look less like something borrowed and more like something earned. The trees wore their green with pride now. The creek had softened its angry winter growl into a burbling, cheerful hum. And inside the cabin tucked beneath the foothills, laughter had begun to settle into the wood like smoke. Isaac had taken to calling himself man of the house whenever Heath stepped outside, even if only to chop wood or tend to the chickens. Lottie had learned to braid her own hair, though she still insisted on making Nora do it proper before Sunday mornings. And Nora herself had grown taller, bolder, not just in her questions but in the way she carried herself. Her voice no longer cracked when she spoke to strangers. She looked them in the eye now. Heath sometimes caught her in the mirror when she thought no one was watching, adjusting the ribbon in her hair with the shy poise of a girl trying to become a lady. The family they had become wasn't something forged in ceremony or stitched together by law alone. It was in the way the porch boards creaked beneath their collective weight after dinner, in the mugs placed side by side on the shelf, in the coat hooks bearing 3 small jackets alongside one much larger. There were no bloodlines here, only bonds. But May brought more than warmth, it brought strangers. Heath saw the man on the second Wednesday, riding up from the East Trail. He came slow, his horse lathered with sweat, saddle worn. The stranger dismounted outside the fence and simply stood there, staring at the cabin like it was something lost to him. Heath stepped down from the porch, heart tight. "Help you with something?" he asked. The man nodded once, looking for a girl named Nora. Heath's chest locked up. He studied the man's sunken eyes, mouth pressed thin. 40, maybe older, but years hadn't been kind to him. His jacket looked stitched more times than it had been cleaned. He smelled of old tobacco and travel. "She's not available," Heath said, each word deliberate. The man didn't flinch. "I ain't here to cause trouble. I was told she was here. I ain't seen her in 6 years." "How'd you know where to look?" "Someone in Larkspur said a mountain man with 3 kids came through the courthouse, signing names. Said one was Nora James." Heath felt cold trickle down his spine. Larkspur was nearly 2 towns over. How far had this man traveled to sniff out her name? He nodded toward the fence. "What's your name?" The man hesitated. "Robert James, her father." The name hit Heath like a rock to the chest, not because he doubted it, but because Nora had never once spoken of her parents. Not a name, not a memory, not a hint. That silence had said more than words ever could. "She doesn't know you're here," Heath said. "I figured." "You planning to take her?" Robert's gaze softened, but it was weary. "No, just want to see her, that's all. If she don't want to talk, I'll ride off. I swear it." Heath stared at him a long while. Then he turned back to the cabin and gave a low whistle, 2 short bursts. Nora stepped outside, her braid undone, dirt on her hands from digging in the garden. She looked confused at first. Then she saw the man at the fence. Her feet froze to the steps. "Pa," she whispered. Heath watched her shoulders slump, not with fear, not even with sadness, but with something colder, weariness that a child should never carry. "Didn't expect you," she said, voice flat. Robert took off his hat. "Didn't think you would." There was silence. The birds didn't dare sing. "Why now?" she asked. "I got sober," he said. "1.5 years now. Thought about coming sooner, but I didn't want to mess up whatever you had going." "You left me," she said. "Left me with no one." He nodded. "I know." She didn't move. Heath didn't either. Robert sighed. "I just wanted to see you, know you're okay." Nora finally looked at Heath, as if asking permission without saying it. He gave a tiny nod. She stepped off the porch slowly. When she reached the fence, she stood a full yard away from her father. "I'm okay," she said. Robert looked down at his boots, then back up at her. "You look like your mama." Nora's lips trembled, but she caught herself. "Do you remember her?" she asked. Robert blinked hard. "Every day." There was a beat of silence. Then, to Heath's surprise, Nora reached out and handed Robert something small, a photograph. Heath recognized it, the one she kept in the back of her prayer book. Her, as a baby, held by a young woman with the kindest eyes he'd ever seen. Robert took it like it was made of glass. His knees buckled slightly. "She was better than both of us," Nora said, "but I'm trying to be like her." Robert nodded slowly, pressing the photo to his chest. "You already are," he whispered. She didn't say goodbye. She simply turned and walked back to the porch. Heath watched her ascend the steps, shoulders heavy but unbroken. Robert stood there a minute longer. Then he tucked the photo into his coat and mounted up again. He didn't look back. The children never asked who he was. Somehow, they seemed to understand that not every question deserved an answer. But that night, Heath found Nora on the back porch, watching fireflies blink in and out like sparks. "You okay?" he asked. She shrugged. "I think so. I thought I'd feel angry or maybe cry, but I just feel full, like a door closed that I didn't even know was open. He sat beside her. "Do you still want me?" she asked, voice barely audible. He turned to her, expression thunderous with love. "I didn't take you in because I had to. I chose you, I still do, every day." She didn't cry. She just leaned her head on his shoulder and stayed there until the fireflies were gone. June rolled in with a vengeance, all heat and blooming wildflowers. Heath's hand stayed busy from sunup to sundown, plowing a new garden plot, fixing the leaky roof, helping Isaac build a treehouse that mostly resembled a nest. But the ache in his chest returned one night, sudden and sharp. He collapsed just outside the barn. It was Isaac who found him, who ran faster than ever had before, who screamed loud enough for the mountains to hear. Nora and Lottie dragged him inside, tucked blankets around him, poured water between his lips. But it wasn't fever this time, it was his heart. Heath awoke days later, sunlight streaming in through the windows. A doctor from town sat beside him, face grim but kind. "You're lucky, Heath, that could have been the end. You need to slow down, rest more." Heath glanced around the room, saw Nora asleep in the chair by the fire, Lottie curled on the rug like a pup, Isaac at the window watching birds. "Don't think I can," Heath murmured. The doctor smiled, "Then do it for them." And he did. They found ways to let him rest. Isaac took over most of the heavy chores, his small frame stronger than anyone expected. Nora cooked more, often trying out new recipes with odd results but undeniable pride. And Lottie, perhaps the youngest, became his fiercest nurse, scolding him for standing too long, insisting he drink more broth. Heath healed slowly, not just in body but in soul. Because lying in that bed, watching them tend to life and to him with such devotion, he realized something. He had been wrong all along. He wasn't just their guardian. They were his salvation. He had walked off the mountain a broken, barren man. Now he was full. Full of love. Full of purpose. Full of names that once didn't belong to him, but now rang clear as his own. And on one quiet morning, as he sat beneath the porch roof with Lottie curled against his side, Isaac sketching nearby and Nora reading aloud from her Bible, Heath felt a tear slip down his cheek, not from sorrow, but from the unspeakable gratitude of a man who had nothing and somehow found everything. He wiped it away quickly. But Lottie saw. "Don't cry, Pa," she said. "We're right here." He smiled. "I know, sweetheart," he whispered. "I know." The sun rose slow and gold that morning, the kind of light that made even the dust look like something holy. It stretched through the windows of Heath McAllister's cabin and landed gently on the floorboards worn by bare feet and boot heels alike. Inside, the world stirred with the rhythm of a family that no longer questioned if they belonged together. They simply did. And though the scars of the past were still there, hidden beneath callous skin and behind soft eyes, they no longer bled. Heath sat on the porch, a blanket across his lap, not for warmth but because Lottie had insisted, saying, "You ain't all the way fixed yet." He didn't argue, not with her. She was more stubborn than the wind, that one, and gentler than spring rain. All three of them were out in the yard now, Nora on her knees, coaxing early peas out of the garden, Isaac dragging a wooden crate across the dirt, planning something for the chickens, and Lottie chasing a butterfly in wide circles, arms flailing, voice pealing with laughter. Heath could have watched them forever. He hoped he would. That morning, a letter arrived. It came not by stage or postman but by Sheriff Crane himself, who rode up from town on a speckled mare with dust on his coat and worry behind his eyes. He dismounted slow, hat in hand. Heath rose stiffly, leaning on the porch beam. "What brings you this far up, Crane?" he asked. The sheriff didn't answer at first, just reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, yellowed at the corners. Heath took it without a word. It was addressed in a woman's hand, careful script, the kind that made you think of school teachers or piano players. He opened it slowly. The sheriff stayed quiet, boots crunching beneath him. Heath read the first few lines, and his knees nearly gave. It was from Rose. The name hit him like thunder, a name he hadn't heard in over a decade, a name he'd buried deeper than the stone cross on that forgotten trail. Rose, his wife, or the woman who once bore that title before vanishing in the night with nothing but a torn page and a broken vow. The letter was short. Heath, if this finds you, it's because I finally had the courage to send it. I know what I did can't be forgiven, and I wouldn't ask that of you, but I need you to know the truth. I was with child when I left. Not yours. I was unfaithful. I was ashamed. I ran because I didn't know how to stay. My daughter, May, is in Dry Hollow. She's 10 now. Her father passed last winter. She has no one, and I'm not long for this world either. I don't ask you to love her, but if there's any part of you that remembers who you were before me, then please see her. I never stopped believing you were a good man. Forgive me if you can. Lar. Heath stood motionless, fingers trembling. Crane, he said, voice low, you say Dry Hollow. The sheriff nodded. That's where she passed, week ago. May's been at the parish house since, ain't said a word since they told her. Heath folded the letter slowly. I'll ride out tomorrow, he said. Don't wait too long, the sheriff replied. Kid looks like she's made of glass, might crack if the wind blows wrong. Heath didn't sleep that night. He watched the stars instead, listened to Isaac's soft breathing, to Lottie's hums in her sleep, and to the rustle of Nora turning pages in the room across the hall. This cabin, this life, it had taken a long time to build, and now it would stretch again. Somehow there was still more love to give. Dry Hollow was 3 days' ride, and Heath made it in 2. He arrived just as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the little parish yard. The priest who met him was kind but tired. She doesn't talk much, the man said. Won't eat much either. Been sleeping on the floor like a stray pup. Won't touch a bed. Heath followed him into a back room where a small figure sat curled in the corner, clutching a worn doll with one button eye. Her hair was pale like straw, her dress patched, her feet bare despite the chill. May, the priest said gently. The girl looked up. Heath knelt slowly, not too close. Your mother sent me, he said. Her eyes didn't change. No spark, no fear, just silence. He reached into his coat and pulled something from the inside pocket, a wooden carved horse. One he'd made years ago, back when he still hoped to be a father, back when his hands could shape something other than fences and firewood. I made this for someone once, he said. Never got to give it to them, thought maybe you'd like it. She stared at it a long while. Then, cautiously, she reached out and took it. I'm Heath, he said. I got a place up north. Mountains. Cold in the winter, but the stove's warm. Got chickens, a dog named Tinker, and 3 kids who'd probably pester you like squirrels. Still nothing. But she didn't let go of the horse. He stood slowly. I'll be outside, he said. Take your time. He waited on the porch. An hour passed, then 2. And then the door creaked behind him, and there she was, holding the wooden horse in one hand, her doll in the other. He said nothing, just extended his palm. She didn't take it, but she walked beside him anyway. That was enough. The ride home was quiet, but not lonely. May didn't speak much, but she watched everything, the trees, the rivers, his hands as he tied down packs or tended the fire. Once she handed him a biscuit from her own plate. He took it without a word. Back at the cabin, the children stood like statues on the porch as Heath rode up with the stranger behind him. Lottie was the first to speak. She your new daughter? Heath dismounted, helped May down. I reckon she might be, he said. Lottie marched over and looked May up and down. Then she nodded, solemn. Well, we got extra cornbread, she said. so I guess you can stay. Nora stepped forward slow. What's her name? She asked. Heath looked to May, letting her decide. The girl hesitated. Then, soft as a breeze, May. Heath nearly cried on the spot. Nora offered her hand. May stared at it, then reached out and took it. Isaac just grinned. I hope you like treehouses, he said. Ours is terrible. That night they all sat around the table, 5 plates instead of 4. May ate slow, but she ate. And when Lottie dropped her spoon and everyone laughed, May smiled. Heath saw it. He never forgot it. Years passed. The valley changed, as valleys do. Winters came and went. The children grew tall and strong. Lottie became the fiercest rider in 3 counties. Isaac learned carpentry and built a new chicken coop with doors that didn't squeak. Nora went off to school in town, came back with a certificate, and started teaching other girls how to read. May, quiet, steady May, found her voice in the garden, growing things that shouldn't survive the cold but did anyway. And Heath. He never stopped carving. His workshop filled with tiny animals and rocking chairs and keepsake boxes. Folks came from towns away to buy them, but every night he carved something for the children. A rabbit for Lottie, a train for Isaac, a Bible box for Nora, a sunflower pendant for May. One evening, when the moon was fat and the fields hummed with frogs, Heath sat on the porch again, blanket over his knees, same as ever. May came to sit beside him. She was 15 now, taller, freckles faded, but her eyes hadn't changed. They still watched the world like it might disappear if she blinked too long. Pa, she said softly, can I ask something? He turned to her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden horse. I've had this a long time, she said. Why'd you really give it to me? He smiled, rough fingers tracing the grain of the porch rail. Because, he said, I made it for a child I never thought I'd have, and the moment I saw you, I knew that child was you. She didn't cry, but she leaned her head on his shoulder and stayed there until the stars blinked awake. And Heath McAllister, once a man with nothing, closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for a life full of names, hands, and hearts that called him father. The seasons rolled like wagon wheels, slow and creaking, sometimes mud-slicked and bitter, sometimes smooth with bloom and light. Time wore down most things in the mountains. Rivers carved new banks, the wind sanded stones down to powder, and even fences had to be rebuilt every spring. But there was one thing that only grew stronger in that wild corner of the West, the bond that held together the family under Heath McAllister's roof. It had been 5 years since May stepped into their world with her doll in one hand and a carved horse in the other. She no longer clutched either as a crutch, but they stayed on a shelf in her room, the doll faded now, and the horse polished from years of turning it over in thoughtful fingers. She'd grown taller, sturdier, like a young maple rising near the riverbank, roots sunk deep despite where she'd come from. And Heath, for all his gray hairs and aching joints, had never looked stronger. Something about raising 4 children, each with a different sorrow sewn into their past, had stitched him together too. He laughed easier now, didn't flinch when someone slammed a door too hard or when dreams tried to crawl in through his sleep. He was not just a father, he was their home. But life doesn't slow because we've finally found peace. That spring, after a stretch of warm rain that brought the whole valley into green, a stranger rode into town. His name was Camden Rusk. And he came with questions no one wanted to answer. He was tall, clean-shaven, wore Eastern clothes that didn't belong in the West. His boots were polished, his jacket stiff with city seams, and his mouth too quick with charm that rang false in the ears of mountain folk. He walked into the general store like he owned it and left with nothing but a folded piece of paper with directions scribbled on it. Sheriff Crane noticed, of course. He always did. "Who you lookin' for up there?" the sheriff had asked from his perch outside the saloon. "An old acquaintance," Rusk said. "Name of Heath McAllister." Crane narrowed his eyes. He's got a family now. Quiet folk don't bring trouble up that way. I'm not trouble, Rusk said, slipping on his gloves. I'm just an echo from a past he might have forgotten. And with that, he rode off toward the mountain. Heath knew someone was coming before he saw the rider. The crows had gone quiet, the wind changed course, and Tinker, old as he was, stood rigid near the barn, ears up. Nora noticed too, setting down her book and walking back to the house without a word. Lottie paused halfway through chopping firewood and stared toward the trees. Isaac reached for the old rifle Heath kept in the woodpile. And May, standing on the porch with seeds still in her apron, froze. Rusk rode and like he didn't notice the way the air had shifted, like he didn't care. He dismounted smooth, dusted off his coat, and looked at Heath with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's been a long time, he said. Heath didn't answer. His shoulders stiffened. The children had never seen him look like that, like a man trying not to remember something he buried deep. You know him, Pa? Lottie asked, eyes flicking between the stranger and her father. Heath's voice came out slow, careful. Used to, back before I had anything worth protecting. Rusk took off his hat. I come with a business offer, just a conversation, not looking to stir up ghosts. I buried all my ghosts, Heath said. You don't get to dig 'em up. Rusk looked at the children, one by one. His gaze lingered on May. She looks just like her mother, he said. And that was it. Heath stepped down off the porch like thunder cracking the sky. Isaac and Lottie moved to follow, but Nora held them back, hand firm on both their shoulders. Heath stopped inches from Rusk. Whatever you think you know, whatever you came for, leave it, he said. You see these children, they're mine, not by blood but by everything that matters. Rusk raised his hands in mock surrender. I didn't come for her, I came for you. He pulled a folded parchment from inside his jacket and handed it over. Heath didn't take it. Your name came up in a will, Rusk said. Rose's family. Turns out there's land in her name back east. Mineral rights too, worth more than this whole county. Heath didn't flinch. And he said, they're offering a claim, saying she named you as next of kin. I don't want it. Rusk smirked. You sure could buy your children a future twice over. Heath looked back at the porch, at the faces that watched him not with fear but with belief. They already got a future, he said. You ride back to wherever you came from and you tell them that money won't fix what's gone, and it sure don't build what we got here. Rusk's smile slipped. You're still stubborn, he said, still too good for the world. No, Heath said, just finally good enough for the ones who matter. Rusk looked at May once more, then nodded. Suit yourself. And he rode away. Later that night, May found Heath sitting alone outside the barn, staring at the stars. Was he my? Heath shook his head before she could finish. No, he said, not in the way that counts. She sat beside him. Why'd my mother write to you, after all that time? He looked down at his hands. Because sometimes, he said, people remember what it felt like to be loved, even after they've done everything to lose it. They sat in silence a while. Then May leaned her head on his arm. Thank you, she said. He looked at her surprised. For what? For coming to get me, for not asking me to talk, for waiting. Heath swallowed hard. You didn't have to be loud, he said. You were always heard. 10 years passed. Then 20. The McAllister homestead grew, not in size but in strength. Nora became a midwife and took over the schoolhouse. Isaac ran a carpentry business and married a girl from downriver with fire in her step and a laugh that could melt snow. Lottie rode in the sheriff's posse and trained horses with the patience of a saint. And May stayed. She never left the mountain. She worked the land, ran the farm after Heath's knees gave out, and turned the soil with hands calloused by hope. She never married, never sought far-off dreams. Instead, she lived every day building the kind of home she wished she'd found sooner. Heath passed on a winter's evening, surrounded by all four of them. He held May's hand last. "Carved your name into my life," he said. "Never doubt it." And then he was gone. They buried him beneath the tall cedar, beside the first carving he ever made, a wooden marker shaped like a tree. On the stone they etched 4 words: "Father always and entirely." Years later, strangers would visit the valley and hear stories of a mountain man who bought 3 orphans for $3 and found a family worth more than gold. They'd laugh, shake their heads, call it legend. But May would smile from the porch, carving a toy horse for some child who needed it, and whisper to herself, "No legend, just love." The winds atop the mountain ran quieter in the years that followed Heath's passing. It wasn't just the trees that bowed in mourning. It felt as though the whole ridge had taken a long breath and released it in reverence. The cabin he built, which once echoed with hammer strikes and hesitant footfalls of orphans turned children, now stood as a testament, not to a man who had lived alone, but to a life turned full. Every board, every scratch in the floor, every dent in the table, told the story of someone learning how to love and be loved. May kept the homestead with quiet diligence, never once calling it work. Every morning she walked the perimeter, mending fences like he once did. She used his same leather gloves, worn soft, the palms darkened from time. The mule he favored had long passed, but she kept a carving of its face hanging near the door. She'd run her fingers across its outline sometimes when the wind howled too much like memory. The town still spoke of the children Heath raised, of the time he stood against Judge Malden, of how he'd turned away gold to keep something richer. Sometimes May would catch a traveler asking about the infertile mountain man who bought kids for $3. It made her smile. They never got it quite right. It was never about what he bought. It was what he gave. She still carved toys, not for profit. She never sold them, but for whoever needed one. The townsfolk came to expect it. If a child had lost a parent or if someone was having a hard season, a small figure might appear on their porch, an animal, a person, sometimes even a tiny cabin. No name attached, just something to hold when the world felt too big. One day a letter arrived. It bore no return address, but the paper was fine and the handwriting practiced. The ink had run slightly, as if whoever wrote it had hesitated mid-sentence. It was addressed to Miss May McAllister. No one had ever formally written her name that way. It felt like hearing a song in her own voice. She opened it by candlelight. "You won't remember me, but I was one of the boys at the auction. The tall one, not the one you left with, the other. I used to hate you. I thought you were selfish. But later I learned that we were just scared, all of us, and you weren't selfish. You were brave. I've kept track, don't ask how. The mountain's far, but word gets out. I heard about your pa, what he did, what you all became. I never found a family like that, but you gave me the courage to look for it. Thank you. W. May read it twice, then a third time. No one called it charity. Around those parts they called it McAllister mercy. Legends grew. Stories passed from lips to firelight and back again, but the truth remained simple. A man who thought he couldn't be a father bought 3 children for $3. And he gave them everything. Not gold, not land, but love. Enough to last forever.